Good morning. I'm Sana, and you're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. Every Monday morning, I'm joined by experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So grab that cup of coffee and get ready for a fun and insightful conversation. May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. It was first observed as Asian Pacific American Heritage Week in 1979. And then in 1992, Congress passed a law which designated May as Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. The month of May was chosen to commemorate the immigration of the first Japanese to the United States on May 7th, 1843, and to mark the anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10th, 1869. The majority of the workers who laid the tracks were Chinese immigrants. Although the U.S. has celebrated the histories and the accomplishments of Asians in America for the past 3 decades, there are many facets of Asian American and Pacific Islander history that are still not common knowledge. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dawn K. Wing as we talk about how she is contributing to preserving and publicizing Asian American history. Dawn is a reference and instruction librarian at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota. There, she helps students develop their information, media, and cultural literacy skills, particularly through popular culture and graphic narratives. She promotes diverse voices and underrepresented histories by coordinating community engagement events and programs such as film screenings, literary readings, and zine workshops. Dawn is also an artist. Her work includes comics, zines, prints, collages, and more. She is also the founder of Water Pig Press. Water Pig Press was awarded the 2022 Minnesota State Arts Board Creative Support for Individuals Grant to debut her second historical comics biography, Tien Wu, Freedom Warrior, which is a comics biography about Tien Wu, a survivor of child trafficking and advocate for Chinese victims of sex trafficking during the Chinese Exclusion Act era in San Francisco's Chinatown. Dawn's first historical comics biography, Leung Schulze, Translator of Justice, tells the story of the first Chinese American woman to cast a vote in a presidential election in 1912. Good morning, Dawn. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sana. I'm very honored to be a guest on your podcast.
Yes.
And I love that you are sharing your platform so that more people know about these stories and the works that your past guests and future guests are doing. And I'm just happy to talk to you about the things that I've done.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that. And I have to let all the listeners know that Dawn and I, we met last month in April at the Association for Asian American Studies annual conference, which was in Denver. And as Dawn and I were chatting, she was telling me about the work that she does. And she gave me a little teaser about Leung Schulze, the comics biography. And just off those couple of, few seconds teaser about this story, I was like, I have to have you on the show because it's so amazing. First, just the story of Leung Schulze is amazing in and of itself, but then also you as creating this comics biography, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like so cool, like making history so contemporary in the format in which this story is told, right? Like a comic book, but then also just thinking about the connections between her story and even, what's happening today. So I'm just so pleased that you said yes, and we're going to get to chat about your work and a lot of other things around Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month.
Yeah. I just want to say, like, listening to your podcast, and I mentioned to you in a message, just I love your spirit of curiosity. And I really do believe, like, when we connected at that conference, I was like the synergy. And so I was so grateful when I got that message in my inbox. I was like, contact Sana. And then, but you reached out to me first. And, I am very grateful that my love of learning. I'm a librarian, so I'm all about lifelong learning, and I'm an artist, and I like to channel creativity however I can. Not just an artist in a visual arts medium, but in teaching, and in gardening, and and I'm continually growing as a person, as we all are. And a part of growth is really about being open and to learning more about other people's experiences, about history, but also imagining visions for the future. I think one of your guests mentioned the importance of that, or I listen to a lot of podcasts, so maybe I'm merging a lot of different ideas. But yeah, and so curiosity, as you've read in my book, Tyler and Schulze, Translator for Justice, was the impetus. Like, this is, I mean, I wouldn't, 5 years ago, I didn't know who she was, and I'm of Chinese descent, right? Born and bred in New York City, went to public schools, never, right? It's whitewashed, right? History, the way it's taught, or not taught, I should say. And, it isn't until we go to high school, even if those of us who, like you and myself, are wanting to, learn more about, hey, why am I having I have all these questions, and we get to take classes in Asian American studies, if they're even offered, in our universities. Or in my case, I was active with I went to Wellesley College. It's an all-women's college right outside of Boston. And there was the Wellesley Asian Alliance. And I became very close friends with people I still talk to today, like these fierce Asian American women, vocal in the arts and in different, sectors of society. And it's just so important, right, to find others, who want to really make sense of just like, am I the only one who feels this way? And, we mentioned Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, a brilliant book who really encapsulates, those feelings that we were raised, or at least in my case, growing up, second, third generation. My mom's from Hong Kong, but anyway, it was just that kind of like through the years of just keep your head down, don't speak up too much. Just like, like it's a lot, I think, for a lot of children of immigrants, it's like because of the traumas and, the difficulties that our ancestors went through, it's just like, okay, we came here, we sacrificed a lot, and just, go through the steps you need to take to achieve that American dream, right? But as we know, coming back to, history repeats itself no matter what, and in terms of being of Asian descent, Asian American woman, hyper visible, hyper invisible, being scapegoated, for, issues that arise, right, as we've experienced during COVID. And so anyway, the list goes on and on. And I just think that, the art has saved me, as your guest Kibo Drew mentioned. I think like sometimes it felt very overwhelming, isolated. I felt very alone. And but I think my curiosity drew me to people like yourself, and to Tyler and Schulze's descendants, her grandson Ted Schulze, that I mentioned in my book, who, long story short, we were connected because after going to this New York Public Library exhibit in Chinatown, Manhattan in New York, there was a small exhibit called Chinese American Herstory. And I just saw a little blurb of it in Time Out New York. I don't know if it's still in circulation, but in major cities, it's this free arts and culture magazine, and you can see what's going on in your city. And so I was like, wow, I've never saw any kind of event like this. So I went one day, and it was covering the legal history of Chinese American women who broke both the glass and bamboo ceilings, whether, learning about who was the first Asian American woman to become a federal judge, and so on, and some Supreme Court cases of Mammy Tape, who wanted to have her kids go to public schools and not be segregated and whatnot. So anyway, Ty was one of the women featured. Tyler and Schulze was one of the women featured, and I was just drawn to her story. There was a little bit of it, but I was like, well, what kind of led her to that time, to make that historic moment of casting the first vote, and what happened after, and it turned out she had quite the life. And I contacted the curator of that exhibit, thinking, maybe I could collaborate with her on something else. And long story short, that fell through. But through that step, right, of just kind of me as this explorer, And wanting to connect more with that Chinese American history, that led me to Ted Schulze, Tyler and Schulze's grandson. And he actually did research on me, which he should have, because I said, oh, can I interview you, get some more information? I have this project in mind to do like a digital exhibit or something. And then he's like, actually, he when we finally met, he's like, I see that you're a cartoonist, and I'm impressed by the way you illustrate your own life stories. And I think that you, through graphic novels and comics, like that, as you said, like that's what's very popular today, and that would engage a wide variety of readers across ages. And so I can see you tell my grandmother's story in this way.
Wow.
So I kind of felt like, how can I say no? It's such an honor. And that this person felt like he trusted me, and just meeting me for the first time. And I mean, it's just, so from there, the rest, as they say, is history. I didn't know how long. I've never thought really. I mean, as I mentioned, I went to Wellesley. I did major in art, studio art and art history. And long story short, I was like, oh, maybe I'll work in museum education or art education. But then I also love to travel. So I taught abroad in Japan, and then ended up in education. So I was an English as a second language teacher, mostly in New York City high schools, and in my 20s. And then I transitioned into becoming a librarian because I really like doing literacy programming and wearing different hats. So not just teaching in a classroom, but also doing community events and whatnot. And so, that was an interesting kind of, didn't see myself becoming a librarian, but art was always a thread, using visual arts as a way to connect to my students, as a way to, share with them, hey, you can tell your own stories in this way as well. And it can be a fun way to learn a different language, as I have used it for myself when I was teaching abroad in Japan many years ago. And Japan also informed me, and as an artist, in that I got exposed to their rich culture and history of manga, of like, drawing and, telling stories through drawing and writing. And I was blown away. And so that has always stayed with me throughout, wherever I lived, whatever profession I was in, to this day. And I was going somewhere with the story, but I don't remember. But I don't know. I guess just like when we open ourselves to learning, the opportunities that come to connect, and kind of this project. So this was back in 2016, 17. And I at that time, I was a community college librarian right outside of New York City. And I was fortunate that I got funding. I said, I talked to my colleagues about this idea. They're like, you can try to get professional development funding to go out to California, do more interviews, and go into archives, get information, and produce this manuscript. Because I've never done anything like a book before. I mean, I kind of sometimes some people in my past, and my family and my friends are like, oh, you like to draw, I like your cartoon, maybe you can publish a book. I'm like, yeah, okay, I don't know. And I so then I started with zines, and zines is ZINES, which is basically a do-it-yourself booklet that you can publish, and it has its roots in anarchist punk culture, riot girl culture, and even earlier before that, like in the early days of in the US colonies, like people would produce pamphlets, and anti-slavery, abolitionists would basically produce zines, as a way to inform people, hey, like, let's fight against slavery. So zines just have that rich history that still resonates with me. I still create zines, and obviously teach people how to make it, because if you don't see yourself represented in stories, don't wait around for someone to do it. Just do it yourself. You can make as many copies. And sometimes some people who started out with zines, there are publishers that see their work, and maybe they can be more widely published that way, or turn into magazines. As Bitch Magazine, it started out as a zine format, and then now it's still in circulation. So the possibilities are endless. And so anyway, that's what I wanted. wanted to start out with. It was a rather long monologue, but
No, but thank you for taking us on this journey that I see this thread of curiosity, that idea that you started with kind of in the beginning, right? Of being curious and following that curiosity, not letting the curiosity end with just a question or a wondering, but rather pursuing it. Seeing just, a little snippet mentioning Thai and then going to this event and then reaching out to, other people to try to see how can I pursue this curiosity even further. Right. And so this just shows what happens when you really do just like let yourself get lost in the curiosity and just remain open to what might come of it.
Yeah.
So I love that. And what you said about, you don't have to wait to see yourself represented. You can create the representation yourself. And I think that is so powerful because, as you mentioned, for most folks in the US, you don't learn Asian American history. You might get like a little blurb about maybe Japanese internment, maybe something around railroads now, like that time period, but that's about it. And so oftentimes, if you don't see yourself anywhere, you can even stop asking the question. And that was definitely, some of my experience growing up. You just get so used to there not being answers or they're not, so you stop, even you kind of squash that curiosity. So I love that you really followed your curiosity and now you've created something that people can come to in the future, decades and decades from now, this will still be in existence. So what a gift to Ty's family, right? To Ted, but also to all of us to be able to return to this. And I just have to let the listeners know that this comics biography, first of all, is absolutely beautiful. I love the illustration, but then just the story itself, like you said. So you mentioned just a little bitty piece of it, which is that Ty Schulze groundbreaking in casting her vote in a presidential election in 1912. And that's just a piece of it. So I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about Ty's story and maybe some things that stuck out to you as you were collecting all this history.
Thank you for the drill. I love the way you articulate your questions and you just set it up so beautifully. Because what I was going to say is her story just really resonated with me as I discovered I was doing the research. It's really a story of resistance. And it's a story that we need to hear, that I need to hear. And I know that, and that's why I decided to self-publish it. Long story short, I could have had it out into the world sooner, but I wanted to see, okay, maybe I can get it to independent comics presses, talk to some friends, because I've done the independent comic circuits for a couple of years now. And, it's not uncommon for independent comic artists like myself to just self-publish for these reasons. It's like, I just want my story out there and then we'll see if it grows, it grows. And, but the urgency was, as I mentioned, there was all this just very traumatic, anti-Asian violence, particularly towards Asian American women. And I was just, you know what, I need to do this for myself, for the legacy of Ty. She lived in a time that was also very overtly violent against Chinese Americans. And she's American, her parents were immigrants, and she was born in San Francisco's Chinatown. And Chinatowns were created because the Chinese had nowhere else to go. Like they were recorded as cheap labor, to do the most dangerous grunt work for the railroads and agricultural work and whatever. Yet they were not allowed to live amongst whites, right? So they lived in these very small places and it was dense and whatever. So that was her world. Yet a lot of missionaries came in, Presbyterian missionaries, and they're like, okay, this is where we can save like the heathens. It was kind of like this. And it was also the temperance movement. So it was a lot of, they were aware that because of the correlation of the Chinese Exclusion Act was, there was this fear, this yellow peril, they're taking over, even though it was like a very small population of the United States were Chinese immigrants, right? But anyway, nonetheless, scapegoated for economic depression and diseases and whatnot. That didn't stop Chinese immigrants from coming, mostly men, right, for work to support their, so there weren't a lot of women, right? So unfortunately, what happened was there is this black market of, hey, well, we can sex trafficking, right? And so that was the association of like, oh, if you're an Asian woman, you must be a prostitute. Like that still, unfortunately, is very insidious today, right? As what came through, unfortunately, with the Atlanta killings, right? That kind of, oh no, it wasn't a hate crime. He's a sex addict. It's like, oh my God. So anyway, yeah. So I, despite this, she was very resourceful. So as I mentioned, there were the existence of these white Christians, in Chinatown, and they taught English and they provided some resources and they did do rescue work. So if there were women in domestic abuse situations or, like wanting to get out of enslavement, in brothels and whatnot, they physically risked their lives, these white Christian women, along with Chinese American assistants like Tyler and Schulze, because the white Christian missionary women, they didn't speak Chinese, right? So how do they gain trust? How can they really help the community, right? So they knew they needed to get help from women within the community, Chinese women. And so Tyler and Schulze ended up playing a very major role among many of the thousands of women who ended up living there. And so Tyler and Schulze wasn't in a situation where she was being sex trafficked or anything, but she was the youngest of 8 children. She came from a large family. Her father was a shoemaker, and so they didn't have a lot. They lived in poverty, and yet they were they allowed her to take English classes. And so that's how she was exposed. She kind of knew about resources and knew that, hey, if I was bilingual, that would really help me, right? In terms of work, in terms of, maybe possibilities, to have a better life and to also support her family. And that's what ended up happening. So her family was pretty traditional in that, they had daughters and some of them were in arranged marriages. And one of her older sisters didn't want to go through with an arranged marriage, as mentioned in the book. And so her sister ran away to get out of that situation. And the Chinese man was in Montana. So this was like a total stranger. And then Ty was very young at the time. She was maybe 13, 14. And the parents were like, okay, maybe you can take your sister's place. And then Ty was like, no, I don't think so. So I even like that kind of defiance, she wasn't rude about it, but I think she just knew like, okay, I'm taking these English classes, she's just exposed. And, unlike her parents who were working all the time. And so she kind of went over to the church, and they allowed her to stay, and she worked for them in exchange and buying their groceries, going on these missions to brothels or places to actually physically get women out who were in danger, but also going to court. I learned that, wow, like Ty, Leung Schulze, and other translators, along with Donaldina Cameron, who was the main supervisor of the Presbyterian Mission Home at the time. This is in the late 19th century. It was very exhausting work because a lot of, just like today, right, as we know with human traffickers, it's organized. It's, they have a lot of buy-in from corrupt officials within our own country. People don't realize like this is a whole system, right? It's not just like so black and white. It's only the Chinese mobsters, or they're called like triad members, and it's not, and they were buying out, help from the cops and people in the courts. So anyway, it was just a lot of having to go into back and forth into courts because they were dealing with lawyers from these traffickers, and who were very savvy about knowing how to manipulate the system. Oh no, but this woman's not being sex trafficked. She's the sister of so and so. She's the wife of so and so. And and this was at a bigger risk, I would say, to women like Tyler and Schulze, because they came from the community. And so they would have to endure humiliation, threats to their lives, people just saying disparaging things to their reputation. So I can't imagine how that was for them psychologically and spiritually, but yet she carried on. And according to her eldest granddaughter, she liked to sing spiritual songs. So in that way, she kept up her practice. I don't know if she necessarily went to mass or anything, but that community, that Christian community, was played a huge role in her development. And it also led her to become the first civil servant for Angel Island, government worker. She was hired by the government to be an interpreter at Angel Island, so that when there were Chinese women, coming off the boats on Angel Island, she can kind of determine, is this person, a victim of trafficking, and all that stuff. And so that was a lot on her shoulders. And then that's where she met her husband, and Fred Schulze, and or Charles Schulze, sorry. Fred Schulze is her son. Charles Schulze was the father of her children. And he is Caucasian. He's of German descent. And at that time, and not a lot of people in this, another thing. So when I share people Ty's story, it's like learning just all these components of our country, in terms of how it was founded on white supremacy and how it's still pernicious today. So I say, okay, she met this Caucasian guy and who worked there, and they lost their jobs because they fell in love. And people were like, what? I was like, yeah, this is many, many years before the Loving case, which didn't go through the Supreme Court until the 1960s, like 1965. So, and that wasn't even that long ago. And now even today, I'm like going all over the place because history is a mess. History and today, it's kind of like, I feel like sometimes
it's all kind of a mess.
Colluding. Yeah, it's It's like, are we back in those times? Is today
the timelines are converging for sure.
yes, like this isn't new, people. Sorry, I just like and like and I mean, oh my God, I mean, and even I didn't even get to the abortion stuff yet because it's in her story, right?
Right. Well, let's take a quick break before we get to, just so much in her story. And like you said, it's all connected. It's the past and the present. They're always all connected. But before we get to some of, those continued connections, let's take a quick break. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. You're here on Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and I'm here with Dawn K. Wing, who is a reference and instruction librarian at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the founder of Water Pig Press. And Dawn, before the break, you were really getting into the story of Leung Schulze, who you have created this just amazing comics biography. And we kind of left off in Ty's story, kind of at the time where she meets and falls in love with another civil servant on Angel Island, German. She's Chinese American, and so already very taboo. And so kind of pick us up there on what happens. You kind of mentioned that they both lose their jobs, but can you give us a little more context for what's happening at this time?
Sure. Yeah. So this was around 1910. So I believe it was before or around the time when she casted that first vote in California in 1912. So this is before the 19th Amendment went through, so that it gave the woman the right to vote later on. So she was kind of on this path, like with the support of the Presbyterian Mission Home in San Francisco's Chinatown, where she dedicated a chunk of her life to supporting and advocating for victims of sex trafficking at the time. And the Chinese Exclusion Act I mentioned, it was enacted in 1862, and it would go on until 1942. So it's the first and only, thus far, immigration policy to ban a group of people of a particular nationality from immigrating to the United States. But that racism, as we know, and xenophobia still exists, as we're seeing in terms of the violent kind of patrol that's happening on the south of the border here with migrants coming, from Haiti and from Latin America and all that stuff. And so so her story just touches on so many issues that still are happening today. So at any rate, she's very fully aware, right, of just the times that she's living in, and these opportunities are that she's having is just really just unique, and she's making the most of it, not just for herself, but to help her community, but to also be true to herself, right? So it's not like she elopes with this man like just to make a statement, right? She must have known, this is going to be of great risk, but we love each other. They did what they thought, because I went into the archives, and their marriage certificate was actually in the state of Washington, where they probably thought that because interracial marriages there were, not an issue, so to speak, from a legal sense, right? It was probably still a social issue and taboo in that sense. But despite them going out of state, and I'm kind of like maybe I'm thinking it's similar to before the Marriage Equality Act, same-sex couples would go to other states where they could get married and, whatever. So I think they were doing sort of the equivalent of that as a mixed race couple. But nonetheless, Angel Island it's no longer an active immigration port. It was kind of like the West Coast version of Ellis Island, but more to keep out the Chinese. Anyways, she and Charles, like, they come back, and it was just their superiors were like, this is not okay, so we're going to basically ask you to leave. And that puts them in a very rough patch. They had to raise 4 kids, and he dies pretty young, and so she had to raise 4 mixed race children on her own in San Francisco's Chinatown, and take on a lot of different work. And but still, being a translator for the community and helping people get services that they need. She was like a social worker at a hospital. She worked for the telephone company, and a lot of people knew to go to her because of just the exposure and kind of the knowledge she had of how to navigate, because of her experiences working at Angel Island. And she was a huge advocate of, exercise your rights, we can vote now. So she was informed and wanted to make sure others in her community were informed and engaged, however they could be, to lead better lives. And she understood the discrimination very well, because she had to live through it and suffered the consequences. And so they're just kind of going back, she had to deal with, her family wasn't thrilled that she decided to marry a white guy, and his family wasn't thrilled. They went on with it anyway. And I admire that bravery, I admire that they just were very open in that way. And according to her grandchildren, they were both unconventional people in general. He was a musician, and he kind of went off and had his interests, and she loved to gamble, she liked to have a good time. So, she, didn't really restrain herself. It wasn't like, it didn't seem like the model minority stereotype, was something that she felt like, she had to like live up to or anything. And like that, a lot of perhaps like subsequent generations of Asian Americans thereafter feel like that kind of ghost, that kind of nagging, go away. So I like her in that, I can point to her story and be like, this person lived a very full life. She may not have had much materially because of her circumstances, the discrimination, like she only had really up to like a elementary school education. She herself says it in her essay. She only really left one primary source in her own writing and voice that I could find. I asked her family, hey, did you ever video record her? She died in the 70s, so it's like they may have had, they took photographs of her and whatnot, but not a lot. And I couldn't locate any tape recorded interviews that she did. And according to them, she kept pretty quiet about a lot of the things that she did. And for good reason, because some of it was of sensitive material. So I mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act made it it was very restrictive. And so it's like very few people of Chinese descent, like if they were merchants or, coming to the US for schooling, like, okay, other than that, no. But still there was a system called the paper son system. And that was, if you can prove that you were the son or daughter of like an established citizen, if this Chinese American, has a business here, and you're like, oh, I'm so-and-so's son. So there is this business, buying false identities, essentially. So that's how people, like my own grandfather was a paper son. That's how they came through. And so she was probably helping a lot of paper sons, right? And so she probably had to keep that mom. She probably knew who wasn't here legally and, whatever, and connected those folks to resources that they need, medically or whatever. And also I learned that she helped women if they needed abortions. That was sort of for a long time something. I think that her family was reluctant, but she is in a news article, like her photo was in a news article where she was arrested. And it's also on the National Park Service website too, is something, yeah, she was involved in that. And because, and it's also recorded in scholarly texts, such as that by the late Professor Dr. Judy Young, premier. She was an eminent pioneering scholar of Chinese American, her story, grew up in San Francisco, Chinatown. And I kind of honor and dedicate my work to her because this was in the 70s. She was a librarian too. And she's like, no one's collecting these stories about these extraordinary Chinese American women, and they're getting older and they have a lot to teach us. They have a lot, we're not just these stereotypes of either dragon ladies or like little, lotus flowers. It's like no, we are not passive. Like we've done a lot for our communities, and and these women, they have a lot to teach us even today, even if they're no longer alive and present in this with us today, but their spirit is, and because it's so complex. Like we internalize, our parents internalize, or at least I'll speak in my case with my own family. It's like so much internalization. We must assimilate. We must, because we don't want to stick out even more than we do. And, and at the end of the day, you know what? People are going to say or see or whatever, project, whatever they think because of ignorance and because of these pernicious ignorance of the history and pernicious stereotyping through the media and whatnot. But I'm going to live my life and be like, I'm done. And I'm an artist. I like to tell stories in this way, and these are my interests. I love to and yes, I have these experiences because of how people perceive me, because of my ancestors' experiences, because of our race, but that's not all of who I am. And Tai, I believe, just that she just lived her life. She was conscious, obviously. She knew the circumstances and the discrimination she had to navigate, but that did not stop her from being true to herself. Even if people within her community and wider American society were, they probably didn't know what to make of her. Like, this woman just like, she wears traditional, the term, she always wore the traditional Chinese dress. So if you didn't know her, saw it, like, she's just that Chinese grandma. But they're like, oh no, she likes to gamble. She likes to go take the bus and she likes to gamble. And she, isn't afraid to just go and catch a chicken and kill it, and she's not afraid to marry a guy outside of her race. And, and so she, I think her courage and her spirit is, and her resistance, again, she wasn't someone who boasted, she didn't exist during the times of social media, so her world was, she never really left Chinatown, other than to go and elope and get married. And but she still made a huge impact, and I don't think it was in her mindset, I'm going to go out and like, be this, she just was herself. And I kind of want people to realize, like, we can be ordinary people and still in our own ways each and every day. Like if people need help, like in this case of her recognizing, okay, in her community, there were Chinese women, if they had a brood of children and did not want to have another child, right? Like she knew somehow. That's also a mystery to me. It's like, how she get connected? Because that was an abortion. It was I guess they called it an abortion ring, but in the article they never mentioned the word abortion. Of course, this was in the 1940s. They just called it like taking women to these places to get procedures, and so she was kind of the conduit. Like she, would pick a woman up, a patient up, and kind of travel with them in the car. And they would kind of, she would, they had to duck down, so they didn't know where they were going, and then take them to the doctors and, have the procedure done. And so she was arrested because there was this crime that particular it was a mafia. It was like an organized criminal group. They got caught. There was some sort of murder, and then long story short, investigators realized like, oh, this mafia is like running this abortion ring, and so she was implicated, and that's why she was photographed along with other people who were arrested.
Oh, wow.
And she's just sitting there, and she's just looking at the camera. She's just very defiant, and here we are, 2022, and everyone's talking about, freaking out about, as we should, about Roe v. Wade, and it's just kind of like, this is ongoing, like this is daily, kind of, we always have to remind ourselves like what our ancestors had to do, to get have to exercise what they needed to do over our own bodies, and the risks they took. And she was a part of that history. Yeah. And she certainly wasn't the only one, right? A woman across so many communities, and we're still learning, right? Because there's still that taboo, there's still that stigma, and it's, yeah. So her story is highly relevant today in so many ways, and yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it is so important for people to document these stories. I mean, you don't have to be, an illustrator. You don't have to have, great artistic talent to even just record, the narratives of your elders, or even not even necessarily elders, even your peers, right? All of that documentation is so important because, like you said, how can we even remember or draw from some of the past actions of people when we don't know that history? So I think it's such important work that you're doing, and other folks as well, for saying like, hey, these stories are important. And in particular, like these awesome Asian American women, like you said, that aren't the stereotype, that the stories of our lives aren't contained within what other people think about us, which is often the history that we hear, right? Other people's stories of who we are. And I think what you said about Thai is so important because, it is a resistance story, like you said, but it's also just the story of her everyday life. As you mentioned, she didn't set out to say, oh, how can I change history? Right?
She just did.
Exactly. And she did, like you said, this is a story of her being true to herself and kind of living out some values, which even in reading her story, those values become apparent, like being a part of a community, but also stepping in as a community member to get people what they need to just live their daily life. Right. And so I think there's so much in her story that is applicable to today, in just the everyday actions.
Yeah.
And not to mention, of course, all of these other connections, as you mentioned, with xenophobia, racism, and sexism, all of that as well. So there's just so many different layers to her story. And I'm just so glad that you were able to make, to be curious and to make the connections with people so that you could actually, learn more about her story and to share it with us. I mean, what a gift for everyone involved, for you, for her family, but then also for us as readers to be able to learn from her story as well. Well, let's take another short break. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. Welcome back. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and I'm here with Dawn Wing, who's the founder of Water Pig Press. And, we've been talking about this gorgeous comics biography that you created, about the story of Thai Schulze and her life. A revolutionary woman, an amazing Asian American woman, Chinese American woman, who did so much in her life that I think we can all be proud of, but especially as Asian American women, I think there is something so special about having historical figures, right, for us to look towards. Because oftentimes we don't even know some of our own histories, right? Because it's not circulated, it's not promoted. So I love what you're doing with this book. And I think it's just so important too. I'm glad we're having this conversation during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Because again, I think of this month as a time for even us to celebrate some of the histories and little known histories, right? Even to ourselves. Um, so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about this month. And I'm wondering, for you, Dawn, what does this month mean to you?
Oh, that's a great question. It's really interesting because I didn't really think about it. It's kind of coincidental, but I think the first thing that comes to mind is like honoring ancestors
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
kind of converging my own upbringing. In New York, my parents worked, and so my paternal grandparents, my mama and yaya, raised me and my siblings mostly, and so I was over at their house, and I didn't really know much about them. My grandfather died when I was 10. And he was a pretty quiet guy. I knew he was a paper son, and that was about it. And that he and my grandmother, who was his second wife, because his first wife in China had passed away. So my grandmother was very young at the time. She was an arranged picture bride. So
Mm.
she came to the U.S. After World War II, and that's when her and my grandfather started a family. And so they used to have a shrine, they would honor the ancestors. And I kind of, since moving to Minnesota, like I was trying to retrace and kind of like honor my ancestors in the way that my ancestors did. And, kind of do more research on that end, in terms of
Yeah.
just learning kind of like I grew up Catholic, but I don't practice anymore. But
Mhm.
I from a spiritual perspective, I want to learn more in terms of uh, like Asian American spiritual practices. Since moving to Minnesota, one place that I went to was a Buddhist temple, and that's also fascinating history too, in terms of like the Japanese Americans and when they immigrated and continued their Buddhist practice, and kind of how that influenced American
Mhm.
practices of Buddhism, and conversations and questions around appropriation and all that stuff. But anyway, so I guess I when I think about May, I'm trying to, in terms of like learning more and practicing more and honoring kind of like my own background, as being a woman of Asian descent, that end, and as well as also yeah, just continuing on my creativity. The Tian Wu story you mentioned, I'm trying to finish that up, so it's very much on my mind, all these kind of topics about honoring ancestors, whether it's through like putting up an altar, photographs, and like remembering, different ways in which we can, again, integrate the spirit of our ancestors to our daily life, but also creatively continue on producing these and sharing these stories, as I've done with Thai. So I guess that's my answer to your question.
Yes. No, I think it's so important, this idea of honoring our ancestors. And even through these works that you're doing, I see as a form of honoring our collective ancestors as well. And, for me, I'm thinking, especially since the start of COVID-19, how I think important it has been to cultivate these practices of staying connected to both ancestors and that legacy of resistance, but also to one another as
Yes.
well. And I think that's what's kind of on my mind this May, as a time where, this is a celebratory time, or, all these different heritage months that we have throughout the year for different groups is seen as like a time to celebrate. But it's also for me a little time of mourning, I think,
Mhm.
in this, this current time period with so many different social issues, the social injustices happening. But then, of course, especially with thinking about where we are in an ongoing global health crisis. And again, that connection to past and present, Asians in America being scapegoated as the reason that we, even entered into a global pandemic, and just a scapegoat also for, I think, a lot of people's just general frustrations with the world, and the sense of, what's happening next, and, feeling really uncertain about the future. And so I'm also feeling I think a little bit of sadness or grief this month as well.
Same. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, especially as seasonally, people are like, oh, it's spring. And in Minnesota, the winters are so long and harsh. People are like, hi. But in some ways I felt safe by feeling cloistered, right? I'm not as out in the open as much. And I love to bike, and I've had my unfortunate experiences of being harassed and, especially COVID. And so I'm like, oh no, like, so I was mentioning to my emails, like, oh, there's that little anxiety, even traveling to the conference. Or I'll just say this, at the conference, it was very interesting, just visually at the hotel, we were being conscientious. And so we were all masking, right?
Right.
But there in Denver, it was like not strict. I think they lifted it. So I was like, oh, okay, there's a lot of Asians wearing masks and a lot of people around us are not. And I'm like, oh, we were fine, I guess, because we were large in number,
Right,
but
right.
but I live alone, and
Mhm.
I'm very independent. I like to travel alone. I like to do everything on my own. And it's just that it's just that reminder. I'm like, darn, we're in 2022, darn it. And, right, I read about from Dr. Judy Young's works of just describing how Asian Chinese women back then in
Mhm.
the late 19th century were spat on, harassed. And I'm like, okay, here we are again. It's like, I can't just, I'm this, I'm third generation Chinese American, and I can't even just walk out of my house,
Mhm.
without fearing like, it's like, can I trust this person? Can I trust, who's got
Right.
my back? Right. And so you carry the pepper spray and all that stuff. And so kind of bringing back to that kind of why I feel so connected and wanting to do some sort of every morning, just, incense, just like honoring my ancestors, because it's also really about protection. I
Mhm.
kind of feel like
Yeah.
you're here with me, and I'm not alone. This isn't, you've been through what you've been through. And, I'm lucky that my grandparents lived a long life.
Mhm.
And, just we're very resilient. And I think it's, for me, I take it upon myself. It's my responsibility because of my privilege in terms of education, socioeconomically, I've done well. And I was like, I am able to have the time, the means, the energy to do the work I do, to push back with
Mhm.
love. I mentioned, it's like, I'm going to assert, I'm going to push back, and challenge, when people presume something about me or say something that perpetuates stereotypes about not just Asian Americans, but I feel like in conjunction with just, this is a huge moment in time where we all really need to come together, different communities, Black Lives Matter, and communities working for justice for undocumented immigrants, et cetera, like women fighting for rights to have control of their own body. It's all interconnected,
Right.
and so it's like when we come together, there's more power, there's more energy of feeling like, okay, we're not alone, and we can actually get quite much a lot like catalyzed and moving forward. It's not a sprint.
Right.
When I kind of like do my moment of just honoring the ancestors, it's like, this is, do the work now. There's a quote, sorry, I'm going all over the place, but I swim at the Jewish Community Center. I love to swim. That's what I do for my own health. Water is healing to me. And at this Jewish Community Center, there are these beautiful screen prints with like Hebrew writings.
Mhm.
And one of them said something like, you can start the work, something like, don't, and then someone else in the future will follow on it. Just do the work.
Mhm.
You may not see the fruits of it, like the grant, kind of what we hope, but have the vision, plant the seeds, keep tending to it.
Mhm.
This isn't just about me or you, this is beyond us, just as our ancestors, they didn't know, like my grandfather, coming over on a boat, like taking on a false
Right.
identity. Like he was just like, all right, I got to go to a place where there are opportunities so I can just support myself and my family and what will happen here. I can't imagine. I always think it's like, what is it like for you to be a refugee, for you, or for you to leave your, like, it has to be a very dire circumstance. Like, people aren't just going to want to like uproot themselves, right? And that's been ongoing, for centuries. And so I remember, this isn't anything new, and but do what we can. Know we're not alone in terms of who's around us presently, but also who came before us and who comes after.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes.
So it's like, I kind of try to keep in mind, especially when, I'm hearing like the next doom and gloom on the news cycle. It's like, okay, we can kind of freak out for a moment, but let's, get back to business.
Yes, yes, that is so true. Well, Dawn, we are almost at the end of our time together this morning. How can people learn more about your work or stay in touch with you?
Sure. Yeah. Great place is just to visit my site, www.waterpigpress.com. That is where I try to put as many updates in terms of local arts events in the Twin Cities. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I have a shared studio space in Minneapolis. I do go to different conferences, as you know, Sana, and comics festival. So I don't know if you're in Toronto, I'll be at the Toronto Comics Festival, June 17th to 19th. Hopefully I will debut my newest book on Tianwu. And I'll also be at the Small Press Expo in Maryland. It's a pretty major indie comics festival that happens annually. That's in September. So anyway, all the details are on my site. So yeah, check out what I'm up to there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. And thank you for sharing some of Ty Schultz's story with us this morning as well.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Sana.
Thank you so much to Dawn K. Wing for joining us this morning and sharing just a little bit of Ty Leung Schultz's story. I mean, are you not just completely enraptured by the story of this phenomenal woman? I mean, just so amazing. If you want to learn more, you can definitely check out the full comics biography, Ty Leung Schultz, Translator for Justice. Again, I'm so amazed by this story, and it is such a source of empowerment and strength to know that there were Asian American women like Ty, really leading the charge, being the first, of course, to do so many important works, but also, and again, what I think is just so unique about how Dawn, tells this story is it is, yes, a story of resistance, but it's just also a story of being true to yourself. And I think that is a message, that is important today as ever. So for today's positive note, I just want to reiterate something that Dawn shared, which was that, we have to have the vision, we plant the seeds, and we keep tending to those seeds that we planted. And we can rest in the knowledge that someone else will pick up where we left off. Someone else will still continue to tend to those seeds, which will in time bear fruit. And that is a promise that I think we can definitely hold on to today. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm here every Monday morning, and you should join me. Come on back next Monday. And of course, as always, you can subscribe to the show in podcast format, wherever you listen to podcasts. And that way, never miss an episode. And always you get to hear those great replays as well. Can't wait to have you back here with me again next Monday morning.